My name is Abe. I'm really excited to be here talking to you all at ReactNYC. I am going to be presenting a little bit about a project that I recently built called Today in Public Data, and it uses React, obviously, that's why we're all here, but I also took advantage of a newish framework called Next.js, which a lot of you probably have heard about. It was my first time using it, and so I'm just going to kind of share what I learned along the way of building this project, and also introduce you to the Enigma Public API, which is a great source of public data. I'll get into that as I introduce myself in a few slides. But I just want to give you a basic agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself. I'm going to give a little overview on what public data is, because I think we all think we know what data is, but in case you're not sure, I want to make sure we're on the same page. Why I built this project, some of the inspirations behind it, and then a little bit of the technical overview of Next.js as well as the public API. Some outcomes, whether they were successes, failures, or I don't even know how to categorize them, and any kind of next steps that I'm going to be working on this project more. It's also open source, so if you see something that you think might be interesting, feel free to find the repo. There's a link at the end of the presentation. I also will add that you guys laughed pretty heartily when someone mentioned AngularJS, so there's an AngularJS shout out in this presentation. So we'll see what happens. And then again, the goals of this are just to understand a little bit more about public data, understand more about Next and Enigma Public, and I think one of the underlying themes of this presentation is this idea of if you have an idea for a new project, it's a really good time to try a new technology that you've never used. It sounds kind of crazy, but you'll see what I mean in a second. I am a senior software engineer at Enigma, and Enigma is basically a data technology company that partners with enterprises and cities alike to solve real-world problems using data. I'm also the tech lead for Enigma Public, and Enigma Public is our sort of not-for-profit search and discovery platform for public data. And so we've gone and gathered a bunch of sources, of disparate sources of public data, and put them all in one platform where you can easily browse them through a UI. We also have a great API that is what I use to sort of power the backend for this. I also taught Python briefly at NYU, and I'm an ex-webmaster of a moderately successful Pokemon website. And we're going to get to that in a bit as well. So, as I promised, what is public data? Well, public data is any kind of records or information that's released by government, business, or academic institutions, and it's released into the public domain, which means you can do kind of anything you want to with it. This is really great for journalism. As you've probably known, a lot of the biggest journalistic stories of our time have been related to sort of data leaks, and some of it's public, some of it's not. Public data is tabular in nature. It usually has a schema, so it has a well-defined series of fields and then a number of records. That tight structure is sort of contrasted by the fact that a lot of the text fields in public data are highly heterogeneous, which means that you might have a description of a tax form in one data set in a textual field, and then you might have something like a recipe for banana bread. I mean, it depends on what your source of public data is. And most of the data types in public data are strings, numbers, booleans, geopoints, geoshapes, and of course dates. So that's where I come in. Again, Enigma Public is a platform that you can use. You can go to publicenigma.com and check out public data. You can also use it programmatically through our API. And at Enigma, we are very passionate about public data, so we have a lot of favorite data sets. And by far, one of the most popular data sets with us, as well as our users of public, is something called the Automated Manifest System. This is records for ports of entry to the United States, so everything that comes through, say, a cargo ship, anything that's in a shipping container, there's a manifest associated with that shipment, and there's often a very detailed description of what is contained in that cargo. So I searched for antivirus, and you can see there's like pallets of antivirus software and related products. I don't know what that would be, probably like spyware or something. One guy laughed. That's okay. So the point is, there's a lot of stuff in here. And I want to kind of circle to this concept of what I'm calling fairly well-formed dates. So when we think of a well-formed date, we might think of a timestamp or something that has been coerced to, say, a JavaScript date object, and something you can rely on that's reproducible. But public data is full of human-entered text, and a lot of times those dates are expressed in various ways. So I have a record here from one of the AMS cargo descriptions. This is actually a record of a service member's vehicle that was transported overseas and is coming back to the US. So there's actually a date in there. I've highlighted it in white. It's supposed to be yellow again. But the point is that if we're just looking at public data with a date field, we're going to miss stuff like this. So I got really interested, and I was like, maybe I could build something that had a UX based on time rather than categories or content, because a lot of public data portals divide up data based on topic. And that's really cool, but I just wanted to explore what would happen if we looked at it a bit differently. So some of the other inspirations were, the Internet Archive has the great Wayback Machine, which some of you are probably familiar with, which is a way to look at historical snapshots of websites for like any point in time back to, a lot of times you can go back to like 95, 96, which is really cool. This idea of like this day in history, what happened today in the past, or what will happen in the future. Wikipedia, obviously, and then I'm just like kind of a calendar nerd, so Google Calendar. This idea of like what's on the agenda today in public data was literally the thing that popped in my head before this project took off. So this is my buddy, Camillo. He is a friend and colleague at Enigma. I'm just giving him a little shout out because this is where that whole thesis of new project, new framework comes into play. Camillo is talking my ear off about Next.js. He's like, oh, have you tried it? Have you tried it? I'm loving it. Have you tried it? Did this for like a month. And this was the time where I was kind of formulating this idea in my head for the project. And so I was like, all right, fine. I'm going to try this out. And in hindsight, it was immensely beneficial to both my learning as well as just expanding my repertoire of things that I know how to do. So thank you, Camillo. He's really cool. That's his Twitter handle. This is my Pokemon website. So I've kind of defined my, I guess you could call it a career starting at a certain point, but 1999, this Pokemon website with the spiral blue background, that was my, that's the way I learned HTML and CSS and JavaScript in quotes. In 2013, I learned how to use Angular, and I had this really I had a passion for public transit, and I wanted to build something, and a friend of mine was like, oh, well, you could use Angular to do that. And I was like, all right, I didn't know any better. Now I do. And now it's 2018, and I'm using Next.js, which I found to be really awesome, and I'm learning even more JavaScript. And we're going to dive into this app and check it out, and then I'll do a little technical overview, and we'll see where it goes. So it's called Today in Public Data. This is today's data, so you can see all of the dates that are highlighted here. Very faint yellow there on the screen, but if we go down, we can see a sample of a record from a data set, and that highlight indicates that there's a date corresponding to today in that data. So for the Pennsylvania Unconventional Production Report of 2017, which I know you're all familiar with, there is a report for a gas well at a specific latitude and longitude, and the report was generated today. That's kind of cool, right? There's also information about really anything you can think of. One of the more popular things that you see are company registrations. So a lot of companies have a license to operate, and then that license expires or is or it starts on a certain date. And so you can actually go into the future or into the past and see, like this company started business on this day, or this company is actually, they need to renew their license because they're about to expire. There's also a feature to see kind of like a rolling trend line of the number of data sets in Enigma Public for a given day. So you can kind of see, for some reason, June 28th, there are less data sets overall that mention that date than, say, today. This is actually a local maxima, if you will. I don't know what's beyond the 7 days because we haven't looked at that data, but it's just kind of an interesting way to compare days to another. And you can also navigate by clicking on those days, and it'll load that day's data. You can also just enter any date, and that's pretty cool too. So all this talk about Next.js, well, what exactly is it? It's a minimalistic framework for server-rendered React applications. Those are their words, not mine. Well, what that means is it's very tailored for server-side rendering in the sense that you don't have to do anything extra. You can just write React, and as long as you follow a few basic rules, you're going to get server-side rendering for free. It also has simple routing. So the creators of Next kind of started with this idea of static routes around pages. So you can have a component that represents a page, and you can then throw that into a pages folder, and you automatically get routing to that component. So if you have an about page, you throw about.js into the pages folder, and as long as it has a working render function, you're going to get that route served at /about, which is really cool. The other really cool thing for performance is that there's automatic code splitting on those static routes. So whatever you have in the disparate routes, if you deep link into the about page and you have some like crazy graph viz on some other route, you're not going to load that because it's all bundled according to the route, which is really cool. One of the benefits for the other benefit for server-side rendering that isn't related to performance is related to metadata. So Next.js has its own version of the HTML head tag. And what you can do is pass props into that, and it will update in real time. It will also pick up the state of your application if you deep link into it, and you will get that rich metadata as if it were server-side rendered, because it is. The only real tricks to making sure that server-side rendering works in Next.js is you have to use a special function that they provide, which is called getInitialProps. This is kind of like the way to bootstrap the application to set its initial props or state before it's rendered by the server. So as long as you don't do anything crazy in there that can't be also run on the server, you should be fine. Things like fetch, there's an alternative to the web API fetch called isomorphic fetch, which works on the server and the client. So you can just fetch to your heart's content, and you don't have to worry about the server not being able to understand that. The other cool thing about Next that I had trouble getting used to is that the styles by default, they offer this thing called styled JSX. So styled JSX is essentially like a scoped per component style that is injected as if it was a React component. So what you can do is you can specify some global styles for your entire application, but then you can specify your component styles, and they're not going to bleed out into the other components. And this actually, I found that this promotes like compartmentalizing and really breaking your components down into subcomponents. I have a personal tendency to make my components too large. So this was like a thing that forced me to say, hold on, these styles are getting crazy. I need to break stuff down into smaller pieces. So I think that's good. And then, as I said, it supports static routing. It can support dynamic routing, which is something that I needed for this project. So if you need that, you have to do a couple of things differently. You can either use a third-party library that supports more of like a React router style syntax for dynamic routes, or you can actually just write like a custom Express server and do it yourself. So it's kind of up to you. And then for the Enigma Public API, it's programmatic access to the world's broadest collection of public data. It's a RESTful API. It supports all the things that you can do in the Enigma Public API, so searching, filtering, statistics, and other things. It's free. Even with an account, it's free, but you get an additional feature. You can export data into a CSV format if you want to work on it locally. And so for this project, I used the datasets endpoint, and I also used the dataset summary endpoint, and that's The summary endpoint is how I was able to display the counts of the datasets per day. So you can give the dataset summary endpoint a query as if you were requesting those datasets, but in fact it will just tell you an aggregation and a few statistics about the datasets that would come back in your query without actually giving you the query. So the other problem here is that when I showed you that date inline in text, that was just one of many possible formats. Humans understand dates in many ways. People that are entering this data, who knows what they're going to put, if they're going to put the day first, if they're going to put the month first. Some of it is local to your locale, like in your country or your province or where you live in the world. Some of it has to do with language, but at the end of the day, can't be sure what people are going to use. So I basically had to come up with like the most popular date formats and then concatenate that like an OR query and try to get all of them that way. And so that's kind of like a brute force way. I'm sure there's a better way to do it, but at least for the initial prototype, that's what I settled on. So as far as successes for this project, the trend line thing was really cool. Everyone likes a line viz. But what I really want to do with that is to expand it a little bit more and try to see trends on like a monthly or even a yearly basis. And so that's kind of in some of the next steps that I'll be describing. There's also like a lot of weird insights that you'll stumble on that you didn't even know were there. The one thing that I noticed is that there are an insane amount of tilapia fillets that are expiring on a given day. And you might think I'm kidding, but almost every day that I look up, there's like all these shipments and the tilapia is expiring. So it makes me wonder, where is it and who's about to eat it? And if I could only warn them. Then I think the other success was learning Next.js because, like I said, if I didn't have an idea for a project, I may not have had the impetus to learn this new thing. And so I think that's a big takeaway from this as well. This is a shot of the tilapia. So yeah, there's some tilapia that expired last Friday, so I hope none of you ate it. So some of the failures from this project, some of the date formats are not foolproof, especially when they're fed. The queries are fed to Elasticsearch, and so there's some false positives for the date formats, and I need to sort of refine the way that like the syntax that I'm using to do these queries, and I think we'll get better results. A lot of the data is dry or uninteresting. Some of it has to do with the fact that a lot of public data is split into many sub-tables, and there might be like a foreign key that joins all of them. And so if you're only looking at one of those tables, you're not getting the whole picture, and it might even just feel like you don't have enough context to understand what the data means. And then with regard to the counts that I was talking about earlier, I really wanted to start developing some mechanism for caching that, because if there's multiple people looking at the same times a day, Enigma Public isn't getting so much data in that those counts are always changing like hour by hour or day by day. So I think if like one person requests a crazy date, we could just cache that for a while and then refresh it as needed. So some of the next steps, I'd like to write a custom server or use what I think is the community's gold standard for React router style routes. It's called Next routes, to kind of like make the dynamic routing better and to offer an easier way to create dynamic routes, because it's kind of a pain. I also want to try to use natural language processing on the datasets to try to give a summary of the dataset, so that you're not just looking at tabular data, you're looking at like an interpretation of it, like almost like a headline or something. And then I would like to cache more, and then I would also like to detect other dates in the data. Because you can remember, if there's one date in text, there's often more. There might be like tilapia best by date, tilapia shipment date. And so if we can identify those, I could create links and then navigate all through the tilapia. So the next step is really just to have like a tilapia website. I think this is really the only takeaway is tilapia. So in conclusion, try to start small with a concrete idea. Pick something that you want to learn, and it doesn't matter what idea you have for the project. I think you should just go for it, and at the end you'll have a new project, and you'll also have this thing like, I can do something in Next, and I couldn't before. And it's all because you had a good idea. So that's all I've got. That's my Twitter handle if you want to follow me. The site is live at publicdata.today, but that will be changing soon to tilapia.today. The repo is below. I'm serious. If you want to contribute to this, I'd be happy to try to work with you. Feel free to reach out. So, thanks.
Angular,
Yeah, it is.
Do you now know when you use Next.js versus Angular, or what are the pros and cons versus?
I follow a loose rule of thumb that's basically don't use Angular. But to be perfectly, sorry, that's kind of mean. No, Angular was important to me in a certain time of my life, and that still sounds bad. I think at this point, I'm just all in on React, and I'm not looking back. So, but I have very fond memories. So.
Okay, this is very context dependent. Okay, I didn't say this phrase at all correctly. So how did you come upon the whole tilapia situation? Not to extend the joke longer, but how did that come about?
It came about because what I said earlier is true. We're I looked at the data millions of times for a given day, and I was like, the tilapia is always there.
It's always there?
I mean, I'll tell you what, I will compile some rough statistics about just the tilapia, and maybe we'll do a blog post or something, and but it's not a joke. There's a lot of tilapia.